The conversations on this podcast are between the host and the guest and are not directed at any member of the general public. The information is for your listening pleasure, but is not offering you any personal advice. If you have heard something that you feel may be relevant to yourself, please visit your medical practitioner or mental health provider. A quick introduction for those of you who haven't listened to the podcast before. I'm Daniel, and each week I bring you a conversation with someone who I think is inspirational or brings something inspiring to the podcast. It's about things that change or could change our lives, and that's why I called it Life Changes You. Listen to the range of topics around psychology, mental health, and inspiration, and find out how life changes you. Hello, and welcome to Life Changes You. I'm Daniel. And I hope you've had a good week, a good month. We've had some great guests on this month, or this season, I should say. We've had Tim from Big Brother. We've had the Mind Tradie, where we had a conversation together. We had Jana Lalick, who was the specialist in cults. We had Rob Mack, who is the happiness coach. So lots of good people. If you haven't listened to them yet, go back and have a listen to those episodes because they're really good and really interesting. And we also had an Olympian at the beginning, and we've had so many different people this season, but we've got one of our favourites back. Everybody always comments back to me, I really liked how you and Isaac talked about all this stuff, and you joke around a bit as well, and it's really easy to understand. So hello, Isaac, Lee, how are you?
I'm well, and I'm glad to be back. Thanks for having me.
It's good. It's always good to have you back. And, for those who haven't tuned in before, Isaac's a psychologist here in the Melbourne, Victoria, Australia. And your business is Functional Minds.
Yeah, Functional Mind Psychology. Yeah.
Functional Mind Psychology. All right. What are we talking about today, my friend?
I thought we'd have a bit of a chat about vulnerability. A couple of months back, I think you messaged me and asked me if I wanted to come on the podcast and talk a little bit about like my life kind of growing up and what inspired me to get into psychology. And if you remember, I responded with, I'm not sure if I'm ready to be that vulnerable.
Yeah.
And then we had a chat about what vulnerability was and how important being vulnerable is. Some of the aspects started floating into my head about what is it to be vulnerable and what are the pros, what are the cons. And so I thought we'd have a bit of a chat about vulnerability and then, see where it takes us.
All right. Well, before we started, I just looked up what vulnerable was in the dictionary, and it says exposed to the possibility of being attacked or harmed, either physically or emotionally. Now, is that what you take vulnerability as? I mean, I thought it was also about just being open and honest and...
Yeah, being open and honest, but I think that there's a component of risk in terms of the possibility of getting hurt.
Yeah.
Like when you ask somebody out on a date, you have to be vulnerable because there's a chance that they say no.
Yeah.
And that might hurt you emotionally, might damage the ego a little bit. But there's also this really intense possibility for positivity. If they say yes and you live happily ever after.
And now you've just used that as an example. As you were saying it, I'm thinking, when I was younger, if someone said no, I was like not heartbroken, but oh my God, why don't they want to go out on a date? Now that I'm older, I don't even ask people out on dates.
Yeah.
Is that because I don't want to be vulnerable, or is that because I'm just past it?
Well, I think that there's a certain amount of being past it, sure. But there's we learn from that. You ask somebody out on the date, they said no, emotional hurt, right? Pain. Yeah. Ask a different person out, they might say no, emotional pain. And then what happens is you learn, okay, if I'm vulnerable in this way, if I put myself out there, the most likely outcome is that I'm going to be hurt.
Yeah.
And so that's when you stop doing it.
Yeah.
So I think for some people, they stop doing these things because of the possibility or the probability of being hurt. And so we stop being vulnerable in those ways, which kind of shuts us off to the possibility of some really lovely things.
Yeah.
Whilst also protecting us sometimes from some really unpleasant things. So it's not a black or white situation. It's not like, just be vulnerable all the time. Like, just keep getting hurt all the time. But it's also about kind of having a reflection on what vulnerability means to you and whether the possibility of getting hurt again is worth the possibility of that positive outcome.
So I guess for people who have had more major traumas in their life around different things, not necessarily just relationships, it would be a lot harder for them to be vulnerable, wouldn't it? Because I guess they've got a lot more, walls up against them to protect them. And so to actually let them down, it must take a lot more. I know with Emma, who was on the podcast earlier this month, who grew up in a cult, she said, well, we've been planning her podcast for 2 years, and it was about her wanting to feel safe when it goes out. And she had to break down some barriers and adjust some things in her head to make sure that she felt confident that when it went out, she was okay with people hearing her story. So I guess she was learning to become more vulnerable after what she'd been through.
Yeah. And it's hard, right?
Yeah.
Like, we can have lots of different things that we experience in our childhood that might just encourage us, to shut down on some of those levels. I was thinking about in the context of even just apologizing to somebody, admitting fault, right? Admitting that you have done something that has hurt somebody else. It's actually, there's a component that is quite difficult to do because like when we're kids, right? If we do the wrong thing, if we're naughty, then we get told off, right? Yeah. We're provided a punishment, so an unpleasant stimulus that discourages us from doing that. And I think that it means that it's actually quite hard, like for a lot of people in adult life, to just stop and acknowledge that they've done something that's hurt somebody else. So even just saying, I am sorry for this, taking responsibility for what you've done or said that has hurt the other person. We can often just try to lessen that vulnerability by saying, I didn't mean it, or you've misinterpreted it. There's lots of different ways that we try to protect ourselves or make ourselves less vulnerable.
Yeah.
Often that doesn't actually help.
And I think as you get older as well, it does become harder, doesn't it? Because you've been through so many other different situations that then when you actually have to apologize, you're thinking, well, did I really do this right? I guess we overanalyze some things as well, rather than just saying, look, I'm sorry, I was wrong, or I'm sorry, I didn't mean it the way it came out, and 9 times out of 10, if you can be vulnerable and say those things, you're going to get a good outcome and it's going to diffuse whatever the situation was.
Yep. It's that act of being vulnerable. It's something that I work a lot with my couples, the couples that I work with.
Yeah.
And actually in session being vulnerable and telling somebody how you feel is, it does just require you, like, what happens if they say that's stupid? What if they laugh at me? What if they judge me in some way, shape or form? It's easier if I just don't be vulnerable. Yeah. And I think that having some difficult conversations, which I think one of the most common that I have with my couples is talking about physical intimacy. So talking about sex, approaching sex in this way of like, this is what I would like out of our relationship. Maybe there's something that's missing in some capacity because there's this fear of judgment, fear of what if they say no? What if I get rejected? What if they think that I'm stupid? And so being vulnerable is a requirement to have that conversation. And without the conversation, you don't get hurt. Like, you get protected in that way.
Yeah.
But there's also, there's that thing that kind of like, what if it was better? What if this other thing could have happened? Or just some frustration. And then that frustration can turn into resentment. And then that resentment can, really have a negative impact on any relationship. So
it's also moving out of your comfort zone, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because you can be comfortable and just stay the way you are and not be vulnerable. But if you're vulnerable and you come out of that comfort zone, you might get a few no's, you might get a lot of yeses. But until you try and challenge those ideas, you're always going to be in the same position and you're never going to know what the outcome could have been.
Yep. Another one that comes up is I'll often see one person and I'll be working one-on-one with them. And there's the possibility for the partner to come in some way, shape or form. So maybe to let me know a little bit more about what's happening, or to talk about something that is pertinent to the relationship, or to talk about something related to their kid. And often it's really difficult for that partner to come in because they are worried. They feel vulnerable and they feel scared. They feel like they need to protect themselves from potential judgment, even though my job is to be non-judgmental. And supportive. But there's still an element of what does it mean to see a psychologist? And there's a certain amount of stigma attached to that, and a requirement to be vulnerable in order to sit down and speak to a professional.
And that's what I was going to ask you, because, look, I've only done a handful of counselling sessions, maybe 10, when I first graduated as a counsellor, and then I changed business models. But what I found was it's really hard those first 1 or 2 sessions to actually get under the skin and find out what the real issues are. You'd find that people coming to counselling would sort of talk about, say, 2 or 3 things that you're thinking, these aren't the real things you're here for, but you have to go along with it and try and get them to open up and be vulnerable and talk about the real things. Yeah. I had a friend who 10 years ago said that he thought he had a sexual issue, and he went to see a psychologist and had his 10 sessions, and at the end said, well, look, I really didn't discuss them because it was a female. And I said, well, you could have asked if there was a male. And he said, oh, well, once I started, I felt like I had to do those 10 sessions. But he never actually got out what he went there for, because he didn't want to discuss his sexual problems in front of a female.
Yep.
So how long do you think it takes people to actually become more open and vulnerable? It's not usually the first session, is it? You might get some, I guess, that come in and just go, this is what's happening.
Yeah, some people, certainly. There's often a thing that happens, which is the real issue comes out in the last 5 minutes.
Yeah. Where
there's 5 minutes left on the clock, and the client knows that, or it might be going to bills. And one other thing, I wanted to just mention about my relationship with my mum, which is really bad, and cool, but we don't have time to go through it, so maybe another time. Right?
Yeah.
I was joking with another psych friend of mine, where we were talking about how maybe we should just change from an hour model to a 5-minute model. So just 5-minute sessions, so just jump straight to that last 5 minutes, and the client can get out what the real reason is that they're coming for.
Well, I guess with that, though, is they're almost setting it up for their next session, aren't they? Wow, I'm so glad I got that out there. So now when I go back for my second session, it's already been talked about and we can start working on it. Because I know most people the few that I've seen, it's that first session, and at the end you're thinking, we just treaded water through that whole hour. And then the next one, it's probably a little bit more open. And then the third one, that's when they go, well, really, this is what I wanted to tell you about. And you go, okay, great, let's work on that.
Yeah. It's a good question to ask as the psych. Is there anything that we talked about today that you want to talk about more? Or is there anything that we missed today that we maybe want to put on the agenda for next session? And sometimes, often, something will come up that we can put on the agenda for next session. Yeah. There's a measure called the outcome rating scale, which is a way to kind of give feedback to your psychologist. So you can give that to your client at the end and say, it's got a couple of different questions on there. One is, did you feel listened to or heard in this session? So you can pick up if there was something that was missed.
Yep.
And then one is, did we miss something today? Was there something did we talk about all the things that you wanted to talk about, or was there something missing? And that can be a bit of an extra step, pro and con on that. But one of them is there's an informal aspect. If you don't have to announce something, but you can put something down on a piece of paper that says, there is actually something that we didn't talk about today. And sometimes that can be a really helpful tool to then put the thing on the agenda that we missed in the session.
Yeah. So vulnerability. So then you were going to tell us a little bit about yourself and why you came into psychology and why you decided to do psychology and how vulnerable you became.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Jump straight into it. It's interesting. Even as you ask me that question, right? Because I'm kind of putting my professional hat off. I'm taking the professional hat on and putting my personal hat on, which requires a bit of vulnerability. There's also some professional obligations in terms of, me not wanting to divulge too much information about myself, because really the work that I do is all about my client, not about me.
Yeah.
My heart even just skips a beat as you ask that question. But
look, Isaac, let's look at it that you're just in a session with me talking about your vulnerability. And no one else is listening.
No one else. Yeah. I think that there's a couple of things that inspired me to get into psychology, and it's a bit weird the way that I originally got into psych. So my mum has bipolar.
Yep.
So she was diagnosed when I was about 10 years old. And she went from doing everything. She did all the cooking, the cleaning. She worked in the family business. She took us to swimming lessons, piano lessons. She used to she'd only sleep about 4 hours a day, I reckon.
Right.
And then when I was 10, she had a breakdown and she went from doing all the things and sleeping about 4 hours a day to probably sleeping about 20 hours a day.
Wow.
So she was awake for about 2 hours of the day. Yeah, like we used to like get home from school and she would like wake up and say, oh yeah, I'm glad you're home. Let's clean up the kitchen a little bit. And then she would stand up and then she'd just say, oh, I'm just going to sit down for a second. And then she'd immediately fall back asleep.
Wow.
So there was a lot of like big change as a 10-year-old.
Yeah.
From having a mum that does all the things to having a mum that's just asleep all the time.
Yeah.
So you might think I think that certainly plays a big inspiration in terms of me wanting to know more about psychology. But then there's an extra factor in there, which is that my dad at the time actually didn't believe that my mum was sick.
Right.
And this is where it gets a bit weird, is my dad actually told all of us that mum's not sick, that she's faking it, and that she's just being lazy. Yep. That was his kind of line that he took. And me as a 10-year-old, I believed my dad.
Yep.
And so originally when I got into psychology, it was about proving that my mum wasn't sick.
Right.
So I wanted to learn more about psychology and people so that I could prove that my mum was actually just faking it, as well as like a genuine desire to help people as well. But there was kind of like this internal conflict.
Yeah.
About like wanting to learn more because I wanted to believe my dad. The more that I learned about psychology, actually there's a pretty good session in my year 10 psychology class. So I would have been like 15, 16 at this time. I asked my psychology teacher when we were learning about hypochondria.
Yep.
So you can actually manifest the symptoms of a physical ailment when you have full-blown hypochondria to the point where you believe that you have that disease.
Yep.
And then it actually manifests when you feel like you can't move your leg or you can't move your arm. And so I asked my psych teacher, I was like, oh, what's the deal with like if you had hypochondria, but it was like a mental illness? So you believe that you, for instance, had bipolar.
Yep.
And then you started manifesting the symptoms because of that belief. And my psych teacher knew enough about my family situation that she just looked at me and she said, I'm not touching that with a 10-foot pole. Like, just very correctly chose not to answer that question, which was a good call by her. So yeah, I that was kind of like one of the first inspirations for me to get into psychology. The more I learned about psychology, the more I learned about what was going on with my mum, the more I learned a little bit more about life as well. I realized that 100% my mum had bipolar.
Yeah.
So she was just very unwell. And my dad just didn't want to believe that for a number of different reasons and didn't feel comfortable, I guess, acknowledging that.
Do you think that was also, though, because, say, 20 years ago, there was such a stigma around mental illness and also there was a limited understanding, I guess, of what bipolar was? I mean, bipolar, I guess, in the 70s was people painting for days and then falling asleep for weeks. Like I'm saying like artists and that some of the well-known artists that we know about who had, it was called manic depression then, wasn't it?
It was.
Yeah, they'd paint for weeks and weeks and then all of a sudden they'd be asleep for a month because they'd got everything out and then crashed.
Yeah. I think that there was a lot of misunderstanding and I think we're in a much better place society-wise to understand more about mental health. But I also just think that it was difficult for my dad to acknowledge.
Yeah, and accept.
Yeah. I think it was easier for him in a lot of ways. And there was some external pressures as well.
Right.
And probably a bunch of stuff that I don't know about that he hasn't told me.
Yeah.
But yeah, like all those things kind of combined to, being in a bit of a weird position. But then, when I was probably about 16, 17, so a little bit after that psych class, I started to realize a little bit more about what was going on with my mum and became a lot closer with her. And also just worked out that I'm really fascinated by the mind, but also I have this desire to help people. And that was something that was just, it went from being something that I was interested in. It's just something that I'm incredibly passionate about.
Yeah.
And a big focus on what I want to do with my life, like feeling like I can educate people, I can sit down with people and engage in some talk therapy and actually have some really good outcomes where people feel a lot better.
Yeah.
I think a lot of that is like, I wish that I had somebody to sit down and talk to when I was 15, 16, who could have explained to me a little bit more about what was going on with my mum, a little bit more about what was going on with me, and encouraged me, I guess, to be vulnerable in ways that I didn't feel comfortable doing when I was that age.
Yeah.
So yeah, all those things combined just mean that, I'm super passionate about what I do, and I love my job.
And look, I mean, you just said about you wanted to learn more about the mind and how it works. And from my point of view, doing this podcast, I mean, talking to people like you and the other guests that have been on and doing Instagram lives where I talk to a variety of different people, psychologists, counselors, you name it, I've spoken to those people. I am fascinated by what I learn from each podcast I do, from each live I do. I always come away thinking, I actually hadn't thought of it that way. Or, that's really amazing what they just spoke about. And, and people have said to me, do you learn anything from it? And I said, I'm learning all the time. Every time I get off a podcast, for the next hour or two, I'm buzzing because I'm thinking about all the things we've just discussed and how I can integrate some of them into my life. If there's people I know that are having an issue and that relates to them, how I can help them. But, it's about, I guess, giving back to the community ideas and education that they can listen to and go with and go, actually, Isaac was talking about his mum maybe having bipolar. I think my son or my daughter, I've said this before, people who listen, they pass on the information. And if it helps one person, it's worth us sitting here and having these discussions, because another thing, I don't think a lot of men are very vulnerable because you've still always been told to harden up, toughen up, don't cry. And showing vulnerability, I mean, I'm talking to you now about vulnerability. I've had one other guest on the podcast talking about it, and also someone who was on a live on Instagram the other week saying that they're very vulnerable and they cry and, I'm not macho. And I'm like, wow, this is really good. I'm starting to meet all these people who are more vulnerable and open to talk about their lives and what makes them vulnerable.
Yeah, I think that was what kind of tipped me over the line to talk about my own experiences today, is that I want to encourage people to be able to go, you know what, actually I can be vulnerable, that there's some potential really positive outcomes from that. Me right now telling people a little bit about my story and what inspired me to get into psychology. I hope that there are people out there that listen to that and go, oh, okay, like maybe I can go and sit down and speak to a psychologist, or yes, maybe I can take my son to a psychologist and talk about these things, and hopefully just help people feel a little bit more comfortable in being vulnerable themselves.
When I first started the podcast, I think I've said to you before, I decided I wasn't going to talk about anything personally about myself. But then as I went on into different episodes, then I started sharing about my fibromyalgia. I get emails from guys going, oh, I'm a guy, I've got fibromyalgia. I didn't know guys had fibromyalgia, and you talk so openly about it, about my marriage breakdown and why it didn't work. People are like, oh, I had the similar experience, So when you're vulnerable and you open up and you talk about these things, you find that more people connect with you, because you're not just sitting here like I was in the first probably 10, 20 episodes, just talking to the guests. I was actually putting myself out there as well for people to relate to and be able to go, actually, what Dan just said then about fibro, that's exactly what I get. I need to go and see someone. Or it's about opening up and not holding things back. Sure, there's still things in me that I don't share on my podcast, but there's more that I do share than what I hold back.
That's great. That's great. Yeah.
So is there anything else on vulnerability we need to discuss?
Look, I think that we've touched on some really important points, and I think we've given some examples of that. And I think that hopefully people can be more vulnerable as a result of us having a chat about it today.
Well, look, I appreciate that you opening up and talking about your mum, because just doing that as well will make kids who have parents with some mental health issues more open to thinking about it, talking about it, and removing the stigma, because there still is some stigma out there around having parents with a mental health issue, having kids with a mental health issue. People go, oh, I don't really want so-and-so to know. And by you talking, it opens it up for people to then go, actually, this is something I can talk about. I can be vulnerable, and it's not something I need to hide away.
Yeah, totally.
Brilliant, Isaac. Thank you once again for coming on to season 4. I hope we see you in season 5.
That's good.
All right. Thank you, Isaac. Have a good day.
You too. See ya.
Bye. Well, that was another episode of Life Changes You. If you liked it, please share it with your friends and share it on social media and subscribe. Remember, you can follow us on Instagram and watch live conversations on Wednesdays and get daily updates. You can also follow the YouTube channel and watch live conversations and listen to the podcast from there. Keep sending in your emails and messages, as I love reading them and interacting with you, and I'll always respond to you. So until next week, take care of yourselves and each other.